Let's review how to factor some of the trinomials that we have been working with the last couple days. So let's start with the first one, x squared minus 5x plus 4 equals 0. So the first step is to make sure that your polynomial is equal to 0 and has everything on the same side, which in this case it does, so we can skip that step. Step number 2 is to make sure that if there is a GCF that we factor it out. So I'm looking at my numbers. I have 1, -5, and 4. Do they have a common factor? No. Are there any variables that we can take out? The first term has x squared, the middle term has x, the last term has no x's, so I cannot take out a GCF. So after, I simply move into the guess and check phase, where I make my two parentheses and I start thinking about how I could factor this. So I focus on the first term, which is x squared, and I think, how can I break that apart? And the only way when I'm multiplying to get 1 is 1 and 1. And so I'm going to have x times x. And then I look at the last term, which is a positive 4. And I think there's a couple different ways to get 4. I could do 1 and 4, or I could do 2 and 2. So I'm going to try 1 and 4, and I'm going to put a 1 here and a 4 here. And because the middle term is negative, that means both of mine are going to be negative. So then you check it by checking the loops. You check the outer loop, so x times -4, -4x. And you check the inner loop, -1 times x, -1x. And if I were to add them together, I would get a -5x, which is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the middle term. So this is how it factors. So after it factors, you then have to apply the zero product property, where I'm going to say that this term, x minus 1, is equal to 0. So if I were to add 1 over, I would get x equals 1. This term, I'm going to set equal to 0, so x minus 4 equals 0, and I'm going to add 4 and get my second answer. And I'm done. I have found both spots that if I were to graph it, it would cross at 1 and 4. Let's move on. So now 6x squared minus 34x minus equals -20. So is everything on the same side? No. I need to take this -20 and I need to add it to the other side. And I need to make sure that when I move it over, I keep everything in order. It has to be the x squares, then the x's, then my numbers. So I'm going to rewrite this as 6x squared minus 34x plus 20 now equaling 0. Then I have to look at, is there a GCF? And I'm looking at my numbers 6, -34, and 20. Now I want you to notice that they're all even, which means they're all at least divisible by 2. And so I can actually divide everything by 2, and the 2 is going to go in front. So then 6 divided by 2 becomes 3. 34 divided by 2 is -17. 20 divided by 2 is 10. And then that's going to be equaling 0. So I moved my numbers over from the other side, so everything was on the same side. Then I did the GCF, and now I actually have to factor, which means I'm going to make my two parentheses and try to figure out, I'm going to guess and check. The 2 is going to stay in front. And let's talk about the first term, 3x squared. What is the only way when I'm multiplying to get 3x squared? 3x times 1x. So I know that has to be the case. And then with the 10, I could have 1 and 10, or I can have 2 and 5. So let's try 2 and 5. So I'm going to put the 5 here and the 2 here. Since my middle term is negative and the last term is positive, I know that they're going to be the same. They're both going to be negative. And I'm going to check my loops. So if I check the outer loop, 3x times -2, that's -6. If I check the inner loop, I get -5x. And if I were to add them together, I would get -11x. So did I factor it correctly? No. So if 5 and 2 didn't work, what should I do? I should switch it and see if it works the other way. So I'm going to switch. I'm going to put the 2 here and the 5 here, and then I have to recheck my loops. Okay? So 3x times a negative 5 is negative 15x. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2x. And that, when I add together, does give me negative 17x. So I did factor it correctly. This is the correct factorization. If it had not worked, I would have had to cross out 2 and 5 and move on to 1 and 10. All right, so now that I have it factored, I have to set each of those factors equal to 0. So I'm going to set 3x minus 2 equal to 0, and I'm going to set x minus 5 equal to 0. I am not going to set 2 equal to 0 because that does not make any sense. 2 does not equal to 0. It technically gets divided out of the problem. Here I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I get 3x equals 2. So x equals, when I divide, 2/3. Or you can give me the decimal, and then I'm going to add 5. X is also going to be equal to 5. So my two answers are 2/3 and 5. All right, let's try this next one. It's a little tricky. X squared minus 6x equals 0. So my question to you is this a trinomial? And I'm hoping that you see that it's a binomial because there's only 2 pieces. So the most common mistake when you start factoring these is you want to make your 2 parentheses and try to guess and check. But this method only works for when you're doing trinomials. Okay, we have a binomial. I need to do something completely different. So I have x squared minus 6x. So I should be thinking always GCF. And because there's only 2 terms, they both have an x. So that is actually what I'm going to factor out. I'm going to take an x from each of them. So what's left is the first spot had 2, but I took 1 away. So it only has 1. And the second spot had an x, but I took it away. So I'm going to factor out a GCF of an x, and what's left is x minus 6. Again, you can check yourself by distributing really quickly. You would get x squared, and I would get minus 6x, which is back to where I started, so I know I factored it correctly. So I know it seems crazy, but that's factored, which means now I can apply the zero product property. And so I'm going to set each of my terms equal to 0, and then solve. Well, x equals 0, that's already x by itself, and then all I have to do is add over 6, and here's my other answer. So historically, this is one of the easiest types of factoring, but it's often the most hardest because many students want to try to factor the way they've been learning to factor with the 2 parentheses and guessing and checking, and that's not the correct way to go about this problem. So let's move on to the very last one. 2x cubed plus 13x squared plus 6x. I am hoping that you notice if there's a cube. We do not know how to factor something that is a cubic. So automatically you should be thinking, I know I could take an x from everything. Okay? But while you're also looking at that, look at the numbers. I have 2, 13, and 6. So do they have a common number? No. So the GCF is only going to be factoring out an x. So when I do that, I'm going to get 2x squared plus 13x plus 6 equaling 0. Now I have to actually factor this middle trinomial. So the x is going to stay in front. I'm going to make my 2 parentheses, and I'm going to guess and check. The only way to get 2x squared is to do 2x times 1x. To get 6, there's a couple different options. I can try 1 and 6, or I can try 2 and 3. So let's try 2 and 3. So everything's positive, which means everything's going to be positive here. I'm going to put the 2 here and the 3 here, and I'm going to check my loops. So outer loop, 2x times 3, 6x. Inner loop, 2 times x, 2x. That's going to add to give me 8x, which is not the middle term, which is 13. So before I give up on 2 and 3, I'm simply going to switch them. I'm going to put the 3 here instead and the 2 here. So 2x times 2, that's going to give me 4. And then 3x times 1, that's going to give me 3x. That is actually going to give me 7, which is not the middle term of 13. So I've actually tried 2 and 3 in both spots, so I can actually rule that out as a factorization. So the next logical thing to try is 1 and 6. So I'm going to put the 1 here, and I'm going to put the 6 here and see if that works. So 2 times 6, that's going to be 12x. 1 times x, that's going to be 1x. So when I add that together, I'm going to get 13x, which means I found it. So now, because I started with a cubic, keep in mind I could have 3 answers. So I'm actually going to set all 3 factors equal to 0. So here's the first answer, x is 0. Here I'm going to subtract 1, and then divide by 2. I'm going to get negative 1/2 as my second answer. And here I'm going to subtract 6, so I'm going to get x is negative 6. So I know it seems crazy that you have 3 answers, but you have to recognize that you started with a cubic, and so that's why you ended up with 3 answers. So hopefully after this video you have a better grasp and more problems with factoring, and now you're going to actually practice.